Snow fell upon the little village of Blackmoor as though heaven itself wished to muffle the world's cruelties beneath a soft white hush. Yet for Eleanor Harbury, stepping down from the soot-stained railcar with a faded valise and gloves rubbed thin at the fingertips, there was no gentleness in that Christmas Eve storm. The wind caught her threadbare pelisse, revealing patches her mother had stitched in trembling haste the night before she departed. Even now, as Eleanor pressed a hand against her bonnet to steady it, she felt the distant ache of that parting, her mother's frightened embrace, her father's fervent insistence that this match, this proxy marriage to a widowed duke, would save them all. A whisper slithered through the small cluster of villagers awaiting parcels and relations. "Is that her? The Harbury girl? Good heavens, but she looks half frozen." Another voice, sharper. "A bride indeed. Blackmoor must be more desperate than we knew." The murmurs stung, though Eleanor held her spine straight. She had learned long ago that dignity, once abandoned, was nearly impossible to reclaim. A footman in the Duke of Blackmoor's livery approached with uncertain hesitation, as though unsure whether the woman before him was truly meant for his master. Eleanor managed a small curtsy despite numb toes. "Miss Eleanor Harbury," she said, her breath visible in the air. "I believe a carriage was sent for me?" The man blinked, nodded, and reached for her valise. His gaze lingered a moment upon the frayed handle, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. But he did not comment. He simply guided her toward the waiting carriage, a handsome vehicle dulled by frost and dust, much like the estate it represented. She climbed in, settling onto a seat that smelled faintly of old wool and pine resin, and the door closed upon the villagers' whispers. Inside the dim carriage, Eleanor allowed her facade to soften. Her hands trembled in her lap, not from cold but from a fear she had not confessed aloud, not even in the privacy of her journals. She was being delivered to a man rumored to be severe, unfeeling, even cruel. A man who had withdrawn from society after his wife's death, who lived among creditors and shadows in the echoing halls of his ancestral home. A man who had agreed, perhaps out of bitterness or desperation, to take her as a proxy bride, sight unseen. She touched the ring that hung from a ribbon around her throat, plain gold, unremarkable, the symbol of a marriage that existed only in law. No church bells, no witnesses, no vows exchanged. A quiet transaction between families. A quiet resignation from the bride. Outside, the countryside unfurled as a bleak expanse of snow, hedgerows bowed beneath its weight. Eleanor watched the blur of silver fields and bare oaks, and the scene coaxed forth memories she would rather have buried. She had once imagined arriving at a grand estate as a celebrated bride, garlanded, admired, stepping from a polished carriage to the adoration of society. Not like this. Not shivering in rags, praying the Duke of Blackmoor was at least civil, praying he would not send her home. Her throat tightened as another thought surfaced. She had been promised to a duke once before. Promised from birth. Every governess, dance master, and etiquette tutor had reinforced her destiny. Her mother would murmur, "Eleanor, you must hold your posture so, for you will one day preside over a great house." Her father would add, "Your marriage will restore our family's future." The expectation had wrapped around her entire childhood like a silken ribbon, beautiful, suffocating, impossible to untie. And then the day had come. Her wedding day. A lavish ceremony prepared, guests gathered, servants lined in rows of polished anticipation. Eleanor had stood beside her sister Clara in their childhood room, the air perfumed with roses and lavender, her gown shimmering faintly in the morning light. The duchy had sent its carriage, its representative, its formal blessing. But when the groom arrived, a man bred to consider appearances the currency of success, his gaze had wavered. Faint, but undeniable. His mother, a formidable woman with a voice like sharpened steel, had pressed a whisper into his ear. Eleanor had never learned the words, but she felt the blow when he turned to the assembly and uttered, with chilling politeness, that a mistake had been made. That he would honor the alliance by marrying Clara, whose beauty was better suited, so they claimed, to the demands of his position. The humiliation had scorched her like fire. Clara's tears, her parents' shock, the murmurs swelling into a suffocating storm, it all dissolved into a hollow ache that lingered still. She had gone to bed that night not as a bride but as a burden, the family's hopes now pinned on her younger sister's glittering assent. And now, once more, she was being sent into the unknown, only this time, wrapped not in silk but in necessity. Her father had exhausted every loan, every favor. Her mother had sewn her a gown as well as nimble fingers could manage, but the fabric had been stiff with age. Eleanor's journey to Blackmoor had stripped what little remained of their resources. The carriage lurched suddenly, pulling Eleanor from her reverie. The road climbed, twisting between ancient yews, until a break in the trees revealed the Duke's estate, Blackmoor Hall. Its silhouette rose stark against the storm, a vast manor of dark stone and shuttered windows, its grandeur weathered by time and grief. The turrets cut through the falling snow like watchful sentinels. Smoke curled weakly from a single chimney. It appeared as though an entire household had retreated into silence. As the carriage rolled to a halt before the front steps, Eleanor's breath caught. No welcoming party waited. No lantern-bearing butler. Only darkness, the crunch of wheels settling into the drift, and the heavy beat of her own heart. The footman opened the door. "Miss Harbury," he murmured, offering a hand. She accepted it and stepped into the biting air. Snowflakes settled in her hair, melting upon contact. Her valise was placed beside her, looking terribly small against the immensity of the house. Before she could gather her courage, the great door of Blackmoor Hall creaked open. A figure appeared in the threshold, not a servant, but a tall man dressed in black, his posture straight yet weary, his expression unreadable in the lantern's glow. The Duke. She had expected someone older, harsher, perhaps even gaunt with bitterness. But the man before her possessed a different kind of gravity. Stern, yes, but sculpted by sorrow rather than cruelty. His eyes, a deep storm gray, studied her with a quiet intensity she could not decipher. "Miss Harbury," he asked, his voice low, smooth, resonant like the opening notes of a cello. Eleanor swallowed. "Your Grace." For one endless moment, neither moved. Snow drifted between them like suspended breath. She wondered whether he saw the patches on her gown, the thinness of her cloak, the remnants of a life that had shrunk in every way but spirit. Then, in a gesture so unexpected she almost stepped back, he descended the stairs and removed his cloak, draping it over her shoulders with deliberate care. The warmth of the wool startled her, the warmth of the man even more so. "You must be frozen," he said quietly. "Come inside. We shall speak where the wind cannot steal your breath." His courtesy, simple, dignified, struck her with a force greater than cruelty ever could. She felt her heart waver, as though some long-sealed part of her stirred awake. She followed him into the dim hall, the heavy door closing behind them with a final thud that seemed to seal her fate. Yet as the Duke turned toward her, something in his gaze suggested that fate, for the first time in her life, might not be the enemy. And Eleanor, standing in rags beneath a stranger's roof, felt the faintest tremor of possibility. Fragile, improbable, but undeniably alive. The first night at Blackmoor Hall passed in a hush of unfamiliar comfort, though Eleanor scarcely slept. The Duke's unexpected gentleness unsettled her more than unkindness might have, for she had prepared herself for severity and found instead a man who regarded her with a measured, watchful courtesy. When dawn crept through her chamber's frost-rimmed window, she rose with a sense of obligation. If she could not dazzle, she must at least contribute. Yet the house, ancient and quiet, seemed uncertain what to do with her presence, as though waiting for someone else to declare her legitimate. At breakfast, a small staff circulated with tentative steps, each observing her as though she were a rare guest whose arrival promised a future not yet understood. Eleanor offered polite greetings, but most exchanged only wary smiles, discreetly studying her patched sleeves and softened boots. She sensed they wished to approve of her, yet feared the opinions of those who would soon descend upon the household. For she had learned from the steward that relatives of the Duke were expected later that morning, uninvited, but emboldened by the holiday to intrude regardless of sentiment. Their arrival, he implied with weary resignation, often heralded unrest. Eleanor spent the hours before their appearance wandering the edges of the estate library, tracing titles with reverent fingertips. She sought solace in the muted scent of dust and leather, imagining how one might restore such a room with patient care. She had not been in the library long when footsteps paused at the threshold. Turning, she found the Duke himself observing her, his expression unreadable except for a faint, almost reluctant softness around the eyes. "I trust the room pleases you," he said. "It does, Your Grace. Feels lived in." and deserving of restoration. Something flickered in his gaze, as though she had touched upon a thought he seldom voiced. Most find it dim and disordered. I have always preferred collections to be slightly unruly, she replied. It proves they have been used. A hint of warmth curved the corner of his mouth, subtle enough to vanish if she blinked. He stepped further inside, offering a small parcel wrapped in simple brown paper. A welcome token, he explained, though I fear it is modest. She hesitated, uncertain whether she should accept such a gift from a man who was both stranger and husband. But his manner held no grandiosity, only sincerity. She unwrapped the parcel carefully and uncovered a finely stitched pair of gloves, ivory suede, elegant yet practical, sized exactly to her hand. For a moment, her breath caught. No one had given her anything chosen with personal consideration in years. "They are lovely," she murmured. "And they fit perfectly." "I asked Mrs. Harrow to observe discreetly," he confessed. "Your hands looked cold last evening." The thoughtfulness of such a gesture tugged at something fragile within her. She thanked him with all the dignity she possessed, though emotion trembled beneath her composure. Before he could speak further, the thunder of carriage wheels echoed through the hall, followed by boisterous voices carrying through the corridors. "Prepare yourself," the Duke said with quiet regret. "My relatives have arrived." The household shifted abruptly into movement as trunks were hauled inside and snow shaken from cloaks. Eleanor descended alongside the Duke, her posture straight though her heart pounded with anxious rhythm. 3 figures dominated the entryway: Lady Montbarry, the Duke's widowed cousin, her son Philip, and her sister-in-law, Mrs. Fitzclarian, whose perpetual frown suggested a permanent dissatisfaction with the world. They paused upon seeing Eleanor, their gazes sweeping over her attire, her posture, her very existence. "So this is the Harbury girl," Lady Montbarry announced, voice dripping with polite poison. "My dear Alexander, you failed to mention she was understated." Eleanor inclined her head. "It is a pleasure to meet you, my lady." Mrs. Fitzclarian stepped closer, inspecting her like merchandise. "Understated is generous. And you married her by proxy? My word. How daring." Philip, tall and smugly handsome, snorted. "One imagines the arrangement cost little." The Duke's jaw tightened, but he said nothing yet, perhaps unwilling to ignite conflict so early. Eleanor maintained her composure, though heat spread across her cheeks like a rising tide. Their scrutiny reminded her of standing before the disgraced wedding assembly months before, when whispers had cut through silk like blades. The relatives lingered about the hall, tossing casual insults disguised as etiquette. Lady Montbarry insisted that proxy marriages were practical for desperate families, while Mrs. Fitzclarian praised Clara Harbury's beauty loudly enough for everyone to draw the comparison. Eleanor endured the barbs with polite restraint, refusing to grant them the satisfaction of visible injury. By evening, a formal dinner had been arranged. Eleanor entered the dining room with careful grace, wearing her best gown, still modest, still plain, but pressed and mended with devotion. Conversation at the table grew pointed as dishes were served. Philip asked intrusive questions about her family's finances. Mrs. Fitzclarian inquired whether Eleanor had ever hosted a proper dinner party. Lady Montbarry wondered aloud if Eleanor understood the demands of a ducal household. Eleanor answered each question with measured civility, but her hands trembled beneath the tablecloth. She feared the Duke might secretly agree with his relatives, that he might require someone more radiant, more polished, more capable of sustaining Blackmore's legacy. But when Philip said, with a smirk, "I heard your first engagement failed rather spectacularly. A pity for a young lady so unremarkable," the Duke's fork struck the table with a sharp metallic crack that froze every movement in the room. "You will apologize," he said, voice low but unmistakably commanding. Philip's smirk faltered. "It was merely conversation." "It was an insult," the Duke corrected, "and an unwarranted one." "You will apologize." The tension in the room thickened until Philip muttered a begrudging apology. Eleanor inclined her head in acceptance, though her breath shook. The Duke then rose abruptly. "This dinner is concluded." The relatives protested, but he ignored them, stepping around the table to offer Eleanor his arm. She accepted, stunned by the public nature of his defense. He escorted her from the room as servants scrambled to clear plates, leaving his guests in whispered outrage. In the corridor, Eleanor found her voice. "You need not have done that, Your Grace." "On the contrary," he replied, "I should have intervened sooner." His words, laced with quiet sincerity, unsettled her more deeply than cruelty ever had. She felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. Yet her heart trembled with fear that this fragile kindness might not withstand the weight of scandal. Before she could steady her thoughts, the Duke paused beside the great staircase, the shadows of lamplight brushing across his features with solemn warmth. "Miss Harbury," he said softly, "you are not alone in this house." The declaration lingered between them, delicate yet unmistakably bold. And though the night pressed close with whispering winds, Eleanor felt something shift within her, an ember of belonging, faint but undeniably present, waiting only for breath to kindle it further. The snowstorm thickened as night descended over Blackmore Hall, pressing against the window-panes with the ceaseless insistence of something determined to be heard. Eleanor stood before the drawing-room fire, her fingers grazing the embroidered edge of the mantel. The Duke had summoned her for a conversation, at midnight, no less, after the day's humiliations. She had tried to prepare herself for reproach or apology, yet neither seemed quite fitting for a man who rarely revealed his mind. When the door opened behind her, she straightened, bracing for the unknown. Alexander entered without ceremony, though his steps held a deliberation that suggested he had spent the previous hour gathering thoughts he did not ordinarily speak aloud. The firelight cast his features in shifting gold and shadow, gentling the stern lines of his expression. For several moments, he said nothing, only regarded her as though determining where to begin. "Miss Harbury," he said eventually, his tone softer than she expected, "I owe you candor. Tonight's display was unpardonable." "You refer to your relatives?" she asked, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "I refer," he replied, "to the fact that I allowed their behavior to continue longer than any honorable man should. I had hoped their visit would pass without incident, and in doing so, I failed to protect someone who now depends upon me." He paused, eyes shadowed. "I will not repeat that mistake." Eleanor felt a complicated twist of relief and apprehension. His defense at dinner had carried the weight of a vow, but she feared what such vows might cost him. "Your Grace," she said gently, "I do not expect you to fight my battles." His gaze met hers with unexpected intensity. "Yet they are battles you should never have been made to fight. Not here. Not again." The word again hung in the air like a question, though he did not press her to answer. Instead, he stepped nearer the fire, the warmth illuminating scars she had not noticed before, not physical, but etched in the quiet heaviness of his posture. "Miss Harbury," he began, "you accepted a union with a man you did not know. A union that offered you no certainty, and very little comfort. You deserve the truth of whom you have married." Her breath stilled. "I would hear it." He exhaled, the sound low and strained. 3 years ago, my wife and son fell ill. The physicians could not save them. I was not present in their final days. I believed I had time. I believed my duty elsewhere was more pressing. Their deaths were abrupt, merciless, and I was left with the knowledge that I had not held them when it mattered most. His voice did not falter, but grief threaded each syllable with solemn finality. Since then, I have failed in many capacities. As a husband, as a father, as a man responsible for the livelihood of this estate. The confession, spoken with such calm restraint, struck Eleanor with deep sympathy. She sensed how rarely he allowed himself to voice these losses. "You blame yourself," she whispered. "I do," he replied, "more than I admit publicly, and more than any rational argument can dispel. I withdrew. I neglected matters requiring steadfastness. I allowed debt to accumulate. And when my relatives saw weakness, they seized it. To them, Blackmore is an inheritance to plunder, not a legacy to preserve." He looked at her, searching her face for what reaction she might offer. "The arrangement with your family was made because I needed an ally who would not attempt to dominate my household. Someone who might steady the quiet chaos I have allowed to grow." Eleanor absorbed his words carefully. They were not flattering, nor were they romantic, yet they possessed the rare virtue of sincerity. "You wished for a partner," she said, "not an ornament." He gave a faint, rueful smile. "Precisely. But I did not expect the partner sent to me to bear wounds as deep as my own." At this, she turned her gaze toward the fire, unable to mask the quiet tremor of memory. "I had a future once," she said, her voice barely above a murmur. "Or rather, I was told I had one. A marriage promised from birth, a life arranged with meticulous ambition. Every lesson I learned, every accomplishment I achieved, was for that single purpose, until the day it was handed to another as though I were an error in the family ledger." Alexander remained silent, granting her space to continue. "My sister did not ask for the role," Eleanor said, "and yet she accepted it. My parents insisted the arrangement could not be undone, that I must be gracious, that the scandal would fade. But it did not fade. It clung to me like smoke. I became a reminder of miscalculation, a daughter without usefulness." She met his gaze again, her composure steady despite the ache beneath it. "When they sent me here, I told myself I would bear whatever coldness awaited. I did not imagine I would meet a man capable of kindness." The Duke's expression softened with a gravity that felt dangerously close to tenderness. "Miss Harbury," he said quietly, "you possess a resilience few could equal. I saw it the moment you stepped into this house. You arrived in the midst of winter, carrying burdens that would have broken lesser spirits, yet you stood with unshaken dignity." "You overestimate me," she replied, though her voice wavered. "No," he said, "I speak plainly. Beauty is a fleeting currency, easily spent and quickly devalued. But courage, true courage, endures through winters of every kind. You possess that in abundance." His words lingered between them like a gift she dared not touch. She felt both exposed and fortified, as though he had seen her at once too clearly and yet with a gentleness she had always longed for. "Your Grace," she whispered, "I fear your relatives will not cease their efforts to undermine me." "They will not," he agreed, "but their influence has waned. Whatever they may conspire, I will not permit harm to come to you." Before she could respond, hurried footsteps approached, stopping abruptly outside the drawing-room door. A footman entered with a hesitant bow, eyes darting between them. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace. A matter requires your immediate attention." He produced a sealed envelope. A letter addressed to Miss Harbury. Her pulse quickened. Very few people would write to her now. She accepted the envelope with measured grace, though dread pooled in her chest. Breaking the seal, she unfolded the letter and skimmed its contents, each line tightening the knot in her throat. When she looked up, her expression betrayed the depth of the blow. "It is from my mother," she said quietly. "Clara's marriage is failing. They fear it may end in separation. My mother asks me to return home at once, to assist, to repair what can be repaired." Alexander regarded her with steady, unflinching perception. "And what do you wish?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "I do not know. I cannot abandon them in distress. Yet I cannot easily leave a place where I am beginning to feel something close to belonging." The Duke moved closer, but not so close as to sway her choice. "Whatever decision you make," he said, "you shall have my support. I would not hold you here against your will." The sincerity of his words, devoid of pressure, full of quiet loyalty, stirred a deep ache within her. In that moment, she understood that this turning point was not merely a decision between two places, but between the life she had always been told to salvage and the life she might finally choose. And though the fire snapped loudly in the hearth, it was the unspoken promise in Alexander's gaze that warmed the room more than any flame. The letter from her mother lay on Eleanor's dressing table long after dawn broke across Blackmore Hall. She had read it twice more upon waking, each time feeling the same pull of guilt, duty, and lingering affection. Clara's marriage, once heralded as the triumph that had displaced Eleanor, now teetered on the edge of collapse. Her mother pleaded for her return, claiming that Clara needed the steadiness Eleanor had always provided, dutiful, invisible, taken for granted. Yet as Eleanor moved through the quiet corridors of the estate, she felt the weight of another truth. For the first time in years, someone saw her not as an obligation but as a woman of intrinsic worth. Outside, Christmas morning dawned pale and crystalline. Snow clung to the hedges like delicate lace, and the air held a stillness that felt expectant. A footman informed her that the Duke requested her presence in the west wing. She followed the narrow corridor, uncertain whether he wished only to discuss her plans or whether something deeper waited beneath his calm exterior. She found him in the old chapel, a place whose doors she had never seen open. The Duke stood near the altar where dust motes drifted through beams of winter light, illuminating the carved wood and faded cushions. The room bore the quiet reverence of a space once cherished and long abandoned. He turned at her approach. "I feared you might leave without allowing me a final word," he said. "I would not depart without speaking to you," she replied softly. "My decision remains unclear." He nodded, though his posture carried a tension she had not seen in him before. "I reopened this chapel for a reason," he began. "It has stood silent since my wife's passing. I believed I had lost the right to step within these walls, much less to consider what a future here might mean. But last night, as we spoke, I realized I had allowed grief to shape more of my life than memory ever should." Eleanor's breath caught, for he rarely spoke of his late wife except with guarded reserve. He continued, "You have shown me that partnership is not a matter of spectacle or social approval. It is the quiet, daily courage to stand with another person, even when the world would prefer you be overlooked." His gaze held hers with steady gravity. "The law may have bound us through a proxy, but I would not presume upon your heart. I have brought you here to ask for something far more precious than obligation." With deliberate grace, he bent one knee upon the chapel's worn stone. Not as a suitor seeking permission for what was already his by contract, but as a man laying down the last defenses of his solitude. "Eleanor," he said, voice low and resonant, "the law made you my duchess. Let love make you my partner, if you will have me." The warmth of the chapel seemed to pulse around her, though the air was cold enough to mist her breath. She felt the enormity of his request, not in its grandeur but in its vulnerability. This man, once encased in grief and rumor, now offered her something profoundly human, a choice rooted in respect. She stepped closer, her gloved hands trembling. "You honor me beyond measure," she said. "But I do not wish to choose out of gratitude, nor from fear of returning to a life that diminished me." "Then choose only with your heart," he replied. She looked toward the chapel window where snowflakes drifted like scattered petals. Her mother's plea echoed faintly in her mind, "Clara needs you." Yet the memory of Clara accepting the marriage meant for Eleanor rose alongside it. Clara had stepped into that role without hesitation, buoyed by beauty and ambition. Eleanor had been left to salvage dignity from the ruins. Returning now would be an invitation to resume that role of quiet sacrifice. But here she had been defended before strangers, valued for her mind, her fortitude, her presence. Here she had found not a cold-hearted duke but a man who recognized the depth of her resilience. Slowly, she removed the ivory gloves he had gifted her on her first morning at Blackmore. The gesture felt symbolic, exposing her hands not in vulnerability but in truth. She placed them gently into his. "Alexander," she said, allowing the name to settle with new intimacy, "I choose to remain. Not because duty commands it, nor because you offer me sanctuary. I choose you because, for the first time, I am seen, not as a replacement, nor a burden, but as myself." A breath of relief escaped him, subtle yet unmistakable. He rose, still holding her hands as though anchoring her to the moment. "You will not regret this," he murmured. "I do not fear regret," she answered. "Only silence. Only being unseen again." "You shall never be unseen in this house," he said with quiet conviction. They did not kiss, not yet. The era demanded restraint, and both honored it. But the closeness between them carried a tenderness stronger than any embrace. In the stillness of the chapel, something shifted irrevocably. Not passion alone, but the rooted certainty that their lives, once fractured, had begun to entwine. As they exited the chapel side by side, the household stirred with unexpected harmony. Servants moved with renewed purpose, and even the cold corridors felt subtly warmer. Word of the Duke's public stance the previous night had already spread. Those who doubted Eleanor now regarded her with newfound respect. Eleanor paused at the threshold of the main hall. "My mother will not understand my choice," she said. He replied gently, "Then let time teach what words cannot. Families cling to old versions of us. But we are not bound to remain who we once were." She allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "I am beginning to believe that." They walked together toward the heart of Blackmore Hall, where fresh fires had been lit and the scent of pine boughs filled the air. The estate, long dormant beneath grief and disrepair, seemed to wake in quiet acknowledgment of its new beginning. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but within the walls of Blackmore, winter no longer felt like an ending. It felt like the first breath of a life remade.